when they got to the eastern fringe of the square, soldiers, for no reason that I could perceive, started firing on people maybe 150 metres away who were standing in front of the Beijing Hotel. The soldiers just randomly cut loose, and I saw maybe 10 people fall down as a result of gunfire. I could see maybe 4,000, I'm not sure, students. There's still gas around the monument to the British heroes. By about 2:30, the soldiers had completely surrounded three sides.
Well, a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Captain Richard's final lecture. He's been with us for 3 cruises, and he's added many, many lectures extra, obviously with the extra sea days, which I, as cruise director, are very, very appreciative. Please welcome Captain Richard Heyman today, talking about Beijing. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Nick. And good to see you all up and around yet another sea day. But off we go to Beijing, and as you can tell, I've been up all night doing my embroidery because I'm going to join a new game show in Central Chinese TV called Be Eunuch for a Day. But in honor of the great imperial city, I will be showing you both the great contrast of the old and the past. For those of you who were in Beijing before, it was often described as a dusty and grim city, especially during the real Maoist era where everybody was drably dressed and a lot of the historic monuments were either being destroyed or else they were let to ruin. But in the last number of years, they've both restored a lot of especially the Imperial Palace and other great historic sites, and then also built a tremendous big modern city around the core of central Beijing. So we're going to be going around the bend of the sea and up into Tianjin, and the Baihai Bay I described the other day, which goes in and is a shallow sea that goes to Tianjin. And on our itinerary it always says Xingang. That actually means the new port for the old city of Tianjin, which was the port for Beijing in North China near the Yellow River mouth right about there. But we'll be going off to Beijing, which you have heard and have been there. It's quite a ways from the ocean, and it was the capital that was built to the north to essentially defend against those nomadic invaders from the north, the Mongols, the Manchus, and then others that were on the other side of the Great Wall. But most of the population of China is down around the Yangtze River Valley and on the inland plains, and then Beijing is really almost on the north side of the country as far as the population density is concerned, but it has been the political capital for the last, certainly the last number of centuries, back and forth with Nanjing. But the Chinese claim that they actually have been inhabiting this area going back well into prehistory. And if you have more time in Beijing, you can go out to this museum, which is out in outside the suburbs, where they have the remains of a early primate that they say was the original Chinese origin. They believe that they actually were part of native peoples, not migrants from Africa or mixing with the rest of the world. This has been debated a lot in anthropological and archaeological circles because it may or may not be true. They don't do any more research on it, but that's their original claim, is that the Chinese were originally here. They are the world's longest living active culture. So I'm going to just list here Beijing's brief history, which was founded in the Yuan dynasty by Kublai Khan, and they call it then Dadu, or the great capital. Then the Ming capital came back from Nanjing and built most of the imperial palace under Zhu Di that we'll go see. Then the Manchus conquered it and set up the Qing dynasty, 1644. The British and French came in and sacked the city and destroyed a lot of the imperial garden especially, and then took a lot of treasure and booty back to museums in Europe. And then as the country was divided under foreign concessions, the first Chinese rebellion was in 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. You may have heard about this, where they surrounded the foreign legation and attacked all foreigners, and then another allied army came in and suppressed that. At that point, China might have overthrown its imperial dynasty, but that and the Taiping Rebellion were suppressed with foreign help and kept the Empress Dowager in power. But then the nationalist revolution happened in 1912 with Sun Yat-sen, again put the capital in Nanjing, but then the Japanese came in, took Beijing, and then Mao, when he finally unified the country, moved the capital back to Beijing from Nanjing. Nanjing means southern capital, and some southerners have said that they wouldn't mind having their capital back south, a little warmer and more comfortable life down there. Well, anyway, now you have a big new city that's surrounding the old imperial city. So it used to look like this. It was a walled city with all of those turrets and fortifications that tried to protect it from recurrent invasions. Of course, the city was conquered by the Manchus in particular. The cavalry came down from Manchuria and broke into the gates and chased the emperor. He went out of the palace and jumped off a hill. But most of this is now gone. Only a few of these gates are left. There are still canals in the city. But when the foreigners first came here, this was sort of a wild area. They didn't quite know where the water is or the land. This is Korea, Japan. This is a 1600s map from Italy. But Peking is still here, and we will be going up around in here. But this was a very far away place, as Marco Polo found out. And then most of it was defended by walls. This, of course, is the Great Wall up at Badaling. Most people now go to Mutianyu, which is another area that doesn't have as much traffic, because there's a major highway through this part of the Great Wall, which famously was backed up earlier this year. So if you go out to it, you usually go to a place where there's a funicular, and you could go up and walk along it. It is one of the great sights of the world, though it never fulfilled its purpose to defend China from invaders. It was constantly crossed by organized armies, or else the guards were bribed. And it was considered the loneliest duty on earth to have to be a guard up there. But what it did do very effectively is control commerce and allow tax collection at its gates. So up there, if you go to the mountains north of Beijing, you'll also go on a tour or can stop by the great Ming tombs, which there are 14 Ming emperors buried in the mountains up there, which have underground graves, one of which is excavated, and you can go into it. But it's most famous for this, what they call the Spirit Way, with all these great stone animals and officials standing in guard for the spirit of the emperors. Outside of Beijing, it goes out into a great plain. This is the Lugul Bridge, or also called the Marco Polo Bridge, because he described it back when he was here in the 1200s. But this was also famous for an incident where the Japanese army attacked and defeated the Chinese army near here in 1937 and continued their invasion of China. But other visitors and tourists like Lord Elgin here came in a great pomp and ceremony, and the gates of the city were opened up forcibly to have the incursion into China that was the nature of that century. So that city is still there, except it's extended to become a vast metropolis of about 15 million people, depending on how far you want to stretch it out to the sprawl that has contained it. But the Imperial Palace is very much in the center, and then there are these different districts. The Chaoyang area, which is mostly where the foreign embassies and also large hotels are, is where many of us are going to be staying. The older Hutong areas are in these districts that are colored up there, and then they built ring roads around, so they're big highway rings that have allowed the city to expand well outside of its original size, and also has an extensive subway system. But we will be going down into the central district, which is all centered around Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City, and the other shopping areas and parks that are around the center of the city. And this is where there's still some of the old flavor of old Beijing left, though they've been demolishing block after block relentlessly the last couple of decades, so that a lot of it is not even recognizable as even Chinese. It's a very big modern city around the Imperial Palace. But this is the political central heart of all of China, the great Tiananmen Square, and the Gate of Heavenly Peace is what Tiananmen means in Chinese. And it is the ceremonial center for the parades and also for demonstrations. But in those gates are the entrance to the old imperial city. It was called the Forbidden City because you could not go in unless you were on official business. So the last great emperor is still hanging out overlooking his own mausoleum, which is across Tiananmen Square. And if you wish to get up at 6 in the morning and stand in line, you can file through and formally see him in his waxen glory. But They have considered making it a national monument for other national leaders, but they have yet to be able to bring themselves to take him out because he might melt in the noonday sun. We don't know. But here's Tiananmen Square, surrounded by these great ceremonial official buildings of the National People's Congress and other administrative offices, museums. And so this is one of the greatest, largest squares in the world with this almost Stalinist, tremendous architecture around it. But once you go into the Tiananmen Gate, or other gates that are now open in the Imperial City, you're met by the world's largest palace of over 400 buildings, very large ceremonial halls, residences, and all kinds of gardens all through this vast center of the city. Now, this is, much of it has been restored, but some of it is still a national archive for the Palace Museum. We did not get to go to Taiwan and Taipei, where they took about 10% of the original fine art that was stored in this palace, but they still have most of it, but much of it is in storage, and they can only show some of it at a time. And given the nature of these historic buildings, it's difficult to put up a modern exhibitions. So mostly it's an architectural visit to go into the many walkways over the streams, into one hall after the other, and then in the north side of the Imperial Palace are the Imperial Quarters, and they've recently opened those up so you can go see where the Imperial family lived. Now, back in those days, the whole area was guarded by, of course, armed guards, Imperial soldiers, thousands of them. If you ever seen the movie The Last Emperor, they recreated the living life of that palace fairly well. But it was all guarded by eunuchs, who were the men who devoted their life to serving the royal family. And these were often paupers and orphans who were donated to the imperial court, and they were given their eunuch status, and then they often rose to great power because they were the only men allowed in the quarters where the women were. But they would often act as either regent or ministers, and so these men were particularly powerful, but also isolated from the life outside of the palace. And when they died, they were given their precious jewels back to be buried with them. So I'll leave it at that. But they served, above all, this great or infamous Empress Dowager Cixi, who was a concubine of an earlier emperor before her appointed son Puyi was the last emperor. And so she was famously cruel and also very vain and very demanding. For instance, she would have her average meal. They would bring her 100 or so plates, and the servants would go and she'd just sniff them or pick at them. But she was a very overbearing monarch, and also has been credited with kind of ruining the country under her administration rather than reforming and keeping up with the rest of the world. And she was kept in power partly by the foreign forces that kept helping her and her administration put down rebellions. Meanwhile, they lived in this glorious palace, having a more than opulent life. Of course, that's a terrible competition in royalty. But here's one of the concubines of the young Emperor Puyi. And so these women were chosen and again donated to the service in the imperial family. And I particularly like her dress there with sort of shoulder pads that would cut a swath through a crowd. But they never looked terribly happy in these pictures. It may have been their isolation and the pressures of being in this kind of a social environment were not exactly very happy. And in that movie, Puyi is played by actors, and he kind of slips out the back door and goes out and plays in the streets and realizes that there's a whole world outside of his otherwise very constrained life as the emperor to be. And then, of course, he was the Japanese took him and set him up in Manchukuo as the emperor of northern China. As they invaded the rest of China, he was the collaborator with the Japanese. And then after that war, he was arrested and put into reform labor camp by the communists. And then he ended up being a gardener for his final years in his own palace. And so he's sort of a sad figure of that era. He was, of course, a Manchu, and the Manchurians, when they conquered China back in 1644, they maintained their language. Most famously, Mandarin is the inheritance of the Manchus. But that they were assimilated with the other elite of China, and many of them were addicted to opium, including the royal family. And this was also one of the great curses of the era. If we were coming to visit back then, though, we would have been carried in as official visitors like this, but I'm afraid this service is no longer available. Now you have to walk in. It's quite a hike in some of these places. You have to step over the transoms of all these doors, which are meant to keep the evil spirits out. And this is quite a magnificent structure, and it's now in fairly good shape and is a World Heritage Site. And of course, it's been open to all of the Chinese. Now, this is a picture of a while ago where they are not exactly in their fashionable best like you'll see them today. But just the fact that the Chinese people could go into this palace was a great revelation to many of them, because ever since it was built in the early 1400s, it wasn't open to them until the 1980s. So that's how long it was a forbidden city. And now it's sort of swamped with visitors. So you'll have to, not quite as crowded as Shanghai, but it's a place where every Chinese now goes to visit once in their life at least. And it's guarded by these tremendous bronze mythical characters and many inscriptions and great pieces of art. But I'll note, you'll see on the placards there again the different languages. This is, well, Chinese is here, and then that's Manchurian, Tibetan, and Mongolian. And so this is a remnant of the imperial time when those nationalities were all of some equal status in China. But this great palace is still walled around. The city walls have been taken down, but the imperial palace and the Forbidden City still has its guard towers and canals around it. And then the old neighborhoods are still preserved right immediately around it. They haven't built any giant skyscrapers overlooking it. So you can go up on those, if you have the time, you can actually hike up and walk the Forbidden City walls and go into these great watch towers that are still there. Just behind the Forbidden City, there's Baihai Park, which again is a lake and a canal system. And Beijing was connected to the rest of South China by the Grand Canal, and so there are still waterways all through the city, and there have been plans to connect it all the way down to the Yangtze River. So again, people could go on the canal system to visit rather than take a leisurely sea cruise to get there. But anyway, on the Baihai Park, you'll notice there's a very large stupa in the Nepali style, and that is a heritage of when China was officially a Buddhist country and had lamaseries and Tibetan Mongolian style Buddhism as the official religion of the imperial court. And one thing that the Manchu dynasty built was one of the largest of the Lama-style temples in Beijing on the north side of the Imperial Palace. And this has, again, it was closed down during the Cultural Revolution, and then Zhou Enlai personally went there to stop Red Guards from burning this historic building down. And its great prize of it, though, is the largest freestanding Buddhist sculpture in the world, which is a wooden, it's not cast in metal, it's actually a gilt structure, but it's about 5 stories high, and you can go up into the tower and look them eye to eye and wink at them. But there are many other historic sites in Beijing. This is the great capital for so many dynasties that it has many remnants of the past, unlike Shanghai and other newer cities. But here's one of them that goes back to the early Ming, which is their Astronomical Observatory. When I talked about their navigation abilities, this was one of the examples of how they could use that pole, the Gaobiao pole, which is a shadow pole, and on the top of that platform you can measure the movement of the heavenly bodies and the sun, of course. But now it's surrounded by Chaoyang district and skyscrapers. So if you're on the Chang'an Avenue, which is the main east-west road in central Beijing, you will see this at a corner of a great intersection. But you have to jump through traffic to be able to go up and visit it. Again, on the other side of the Imperial Palace, on the south side, there's the Temple of Heaven. And this is one of the great gems of Chinese architecture, built again in the 1420s as one of the ceremonial temples that the emperor had to go to on a schedule every year. He would make offerings to heaven for rain and benefit for agriculture, and he would plant the first rice seeds here at the Temple of Heaven while a Confucian orchestra played music, and they had a devotion to the mandate of heaven that would keep the country healthy and also the imperial family in power. There's also a temple to the moon and a temple to the sun. And these weren't open religious ceremonies for the public. This was the duty of the royal family to go to these places and have a special ceremony on schedule. This tradition continues actually in Tokyo, where the Emperor of Japan still practices these rituals. Outside of Beijing, for those of you who have been there, is the Great Summer Palace. This is an excursion, especially in the heat of the summer, to go out to where the royal family would live in their small country cottage, which extends for a vast area along this lake that was built just for them to have a view. And so there are actually a lot of temples here, because particularly the Empress Dowager conceived of herself as a reincarnation of Tara, the Tibetan Buddhist goddess, and so she built temples for her own contemplation there. Mostly now it is a great public park, and you can walk along the seaside, and there are many pavilions and walkways, and then now a lot of museums and other features in this preserved site. And you can climb up into the area and see this view of what is the suburbs of North Beijing. Now that has all been starting to fill in with development, so it's not quite the countryside resort that it used to be. But it does have, again, significant historic religious pagodas like this and other evidences of that era when, let's say, especially the imperial family were living in personal isolation and very much in the past. I showed you this boat before the other day. This is the Empress Dowager's tea house boat, the marble boat, which sits on the edge of the lake and is open for a cup of tea there, but it doesn't navigate or go anywhere. She also had built a series of theaters on the lake so that she could watch Peking opera from her own pavilion, whereas the stage is right over here, and the imperial family would sit over there. I guess safe from getting involved in the magic act or something. But Peking opera is, again, one of the great traditions of Beijing. By the way, Peking is the old pronunciation and spelling. It's all changed in Roman letters and foreign pronunciations, but it's always been Beijing in Mandarin Chinese. But we still call it Peking opera because it's a famous cultural form where it's very elaborately dressed and staged with acrobatics. But you note that there's no set or scenery because all of the scenes are gestured. So when one of the officials waves his crop, that means he's going to ride a horse, and he'll walk around, and you should know the story enough that he's riding off to battle. Or if one of the women begin to swoon, that means she has a date somewhere. Or there's a lot of other sort of code gestures that show you what the action is. They're usually a palace intrigue or a historical story, but the other feature of Peking opera, which is hard for us to sometimes listen to, is that they are all trying to play a very intricate melody in monophony, so that the instruments play what the singer is singing. And there is no harmony. And also, these are set tunes that are played in every opera. So unlike a European-style opera where there's new music and a whole different musical basis for the theater, Peking opera is always the same music. And it's a question of how well the performers can do this intricate interplay. Then they have a lot of gongs and percussion that is actually the conducting of the pace of the opera. And so if you have a chance to see it, you sort of have to bend your ears a little bit, because especially the women's voices are very shrill, and that comes from the tradition of having fellows like this. They call it dan in Chinese. It was considered very dishonorable for a woman to be in the theater in the past, so they had men perform the women's roles, and to do that they had to stretch their voice and sing rather badly like a real woman. But then when women were allowed to sing in the opera in recent generations, they imitated the men imitating women, and so it all kind of doesn't sound quite right. But anyway, it's one of the great traditions of Peking. There are many other kinds around China. But here's one of the local arts. Now in Shanghai, you heard or saw that that's a silk producing area with embroidery and things like that are featured. But up in the north, they have cloisonné as their great local craft. You'll see lots of shops full of very big enamelware like this. So that's a tradition that goes on in workshops in Beijing. But what happened, of course, in China was a lot of turmoil from the imperial time until recently. And so here's a graphic from the May 4th movement. I told you how Shandong and Qingdao, where we were taken by the Germans and then given to the Japanese, and the student uprising back in 1919 is illustrated here. And Beijing has a lot of universities, and it's a major educational center, so therefore there's a very large student population, and it has historically been a leading edge for political agitation in the country up till recently. And so when the Civil War was over and the People's Republic was established, Mao Zedong famously said, now China is stood up. It is strong and it is independent finally. And the principles of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, which were independence, prosperity, and democracy. Well, independence and prosperity have come, but democracy is still an open question in China, and that's something they will figure out how to do it on their own. But anyway, Mao and his military leadership, when they established what's called the Special Administration, which means the Communist Party has a monopoly of rule in the name of the people to develop China. And that ended up, though, being a rather intensive personality cult around Mao, which during the Cultural Revolution turned him into sort of the Red God. So I'm going to show you a few of the posters. This one says, toward our great leader, Chairman Mao, we have two words, loyalty and usefulness, which meant the people should follow his writings and build China. Now this is one of the governmental seals, which is the People's Consultative Committee, which is where there's an appointed committee that advises the National Congress, but it's all pretty much directed by the Communist Party leadership, and that meets on its own in what they call a democratic centralism, and that supposedly the Communist Party on the Leninist model is a democratic organization, but it administers the country under a dictatorship. Now this got very, of course, virulent at certain points. So here's a poster saying, we will certainly liberate Taiwan, which I've discussed before. But this whole period of, during the height of the Cold War, where China was isolated, it even broke relations with Russia, and it felt that it had to be strong and independent on its own, and its large population and the health of its people were the basis of its independence. So here you have another poster, the writings of Mao Zedong, and it says, knowledge is power. And then they were, of course, famously promoting revolution around the world in Africa, South America, helping various other peoples in their revolutionary study. And here it says the Communist Party leads the people and will fight to the end for victory. So this is kind of propaganda that is now a collector's item in art galleries in Beijing. They've been pulling these things out of files and drawers, and you can buy them as collector's items of the past. But this is, in some sense, there's a continuity here. Here's a poster that says, we will be strong and independent and we will build a new life. It also says building socialism is a great glory. But when I was looking at this, when I was working in shipbuilding here, they were still using a form of construction management in China, which is design, construction, and correction, all as what they call the three-stage mobilization for building things, and they still build things that way. They're drawing the designs while somebody's starting to build it, and then there's a whole other crew that comes in and fixes the mistakes. But they work 24 hours a day, 8 days a week. As you can see around China, they still have this sort of mass mobilization, and that's, of course, led to a lot of bad mistakes, tragic for the country, many famines and all such, but nonetheless, they're always self-critical, and famously so to the point where they berate and persecute people. But here's an example of today, in this last week in Beijing, they're having the Communist Party conferences to make the next 5-year plan. And when I was in Shanghai, I actually went and bought the book of training for Communist Party cadres, of what to do for the future. And it essentially talks about the need for accountability, technical expertise, and loyalty, and also self-criticism to correct mistakes. Now this is not unlike other organizations, but you have to understand the Communist Party still runs this country very tightly and then trains its own people. There are some 60 to 70 million members of the Communist Party in China, so every unit, every company, every town and village has a party secretary or representatives who then report up the line, and then the Communist Party appoints all of the governors and mayors and directors of companies, which makes it a very efficient administration if it is not too corrupt. But I'll read you just an introduction from this particular document to give you a flavor of of the kind of language that they use. And this is just the introduction to the training manual for party members. It says, okay, committee members, we begin our efforts with a brave spirit and sincere hearts to renew our responsibilities in strength and honesty. May we unite around General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Comrade Hu Jintao, who is the president also of the government, to raise the great flag of China's special national socialism. Deng Xiaoping's theory of the three representatives of Marx, Lenin, and Mao thought is the important guiding principle following the practicality of scientific development for China. We are of one heart, one honor, and we seek truth in our genuine, sincere service. Our strenuous struggle has a path to follow China's reform and opening without any diversions to build a new modern socialist victory. Well, somehow I don't think that's exactly a Tea Party document, but it is very let's say, full of its own self-righteousness. Well, anyway, the biggest problems for the Communist Party, though, are corruption, and also the monopoly they have on power leads to mistakes, not just in construction, but in all kinds of policies in China, and especially since they brook no open public criticisms or let's say, loyal opposition, they are prone to very bad cases of corruption. So here's a recent poster saying that I will have a proper spirit, I will refuse gifts and not be corrupt, which is easier said than done, because in China it is illegal to take a bribe, but it's not illegal to offer one. But anyway, here's the sort of thing that most Chinese will sort of grin and bear these sort of posters, but we love the party because it allows us to have karaoke and other modern things. And then after Tiananmen, let's say, suppression of the reform elements in the Communist Party were put into house arrest, including Zhao Ziyang and his other aides, when Li Peng, the prime minister at the time, sent in the troops to chase the students out of Tiananmen Square, and how many hundreds or thousands were killed, we don't know. But I have a friend who is, her name is Dai Qing, and she was a critic of the Three Gorges Dam project, but she was a nuclear missile engineer and a colonel in the Chinese army, and also gathered engineering criticisms from the Water Ministry in a document that she gave to the National People's Congress, saying that there's problems with this construction. But this happened just when Tiananmen was going on, and when Li Peng, who was by training a hydro engineer and was the main proponent of the Three Gorges Dam, saw this document, which was purely an internal document for the study in the Congress, he had the document seized, and she was arrested and was put into house arrest, where she has remained to this day. And after 21 years, she's not allowed out of her house in Beijing. But she's on her army pension, and she gets to see her grandkid, and people can come visit her. But I just called her. I was saying, I'm coming to Beijing. How are you? And she said she just got out to go to America. So now they're letting her travel. But until now, they haven't even let her out of her house. She's not allowed to speak, read, or talk to anybody unless it's in her home. But nonetheless, this is sort of the soft hand of a dictatorship, where they will, when you're repressed, you're not lined up and shot like you were in previous times. You're just put on vacation, but not a cruise ship. You have to stay at home. Anyway, here's a symbol of the party after Tiananmen. After that spirit of democracy statue was demolished, they put this one up in Tiananmen Square, and then it says, only socialism can save China, and only socialism can develop China. So this was under the, let's say, the moderate policies of Deng Xiaoping, who was suppressed by Mao, came back, and then reasserted his belief that China should open up. Here's a poster about the return of Hong Kong to the mainland and reuniting the country. And it says down there, one country, two systems, meaning Hong Kong has a special status, its own laws, its own local authority, and that's being offered to Taiwan also. And perhaps the country will loosen up its controls politically to allow more diversity of administration, or at least political leadership in the country. But Deng Xiaoping was famous for saying things like, you seek truth from facts rather than a political dogma. And also, another one was, a black cat and a white cat. Whichever one catches the rat is the one we follow, meaning you judge things from results. And then he said we also must have planned for 100 years. All of the planning should be looking down 3-4 generations out, which is what you see going on in China, all this tremendous building boom. Maybe they're not using it now, but they will eventually, certainly. And so Deng Xiaoping is the architect of what has been called state capitalism, but also allowing some individual enterprise and also to help a lot of people have a personal business and soak up a lot of the unemployment that is extensive through China, through allowing people to go for their own economy and their own best interests. So his famous phrase was, to get rich is glorious and it is good for China, and that's what has happened. But the majority of Chinese companies and industries are owned by state corporations at various levels, local, provincial, or national. But the underlying element of socialism is that in China is that all the land is owned in common. In other words, the government owns all the land, and you can lease the use of it, and you may own your individual unit, let's say your apartment, or they've allowed people to buy their housing, but the land that it's under is always under the government to purvey, and maybe they'll change their mind about it. Now, this is sort of I call a neo-feudalism, the way they run the country, but obviously it's been very effective. And also it's allowed China to grow up in a tremendous economy from being isolated and poor to what is now a very prosperous country, if not for everybody. But you could say, who won the Cold War? Well, it seems to perhaps have been the Chinese Communist Party, especially if some nations have to borrow from them to maintain their credit cards. But I won't go into that. I'm just going to show you some more about Beijing, because whatever all this political history, it's still a beautiful city, and particularly because it has waterways and beautiful design. And I'll just show you some of the things you'll see as you go around the city. This is a Sijahai 10. They call them seas in Beijing, but they're just lakes that go all around the town, and you have canal boats and a lot of pleasure in the city, just because in the last decades they've consciously made the city more green and healthy. They've taken a lot of the big industry out of town. They're still subject to inversions and pollution, and especially windstorms from the Gobi Desert at certain times a year. We will feel that wind, but I don't believe there'll be a sandstorm. But in the spring is when they get the dust that gets all over the city, and you've seen pictures of people always wearing face masks. But this time of year, it's getting a little cooler, but this is one of the more pleasant times of the year. So you'll see a lot of people out in the park practicing their Tai Chi or playing with kids. This is Wangfujing, the main shopping district to the east of the Imperial Palace, and a lot of hotels are near there, so you can walk around this area. I think if you're staying at the Peninsula or the Palace or the Regent Hotel, they are in this neighborhood, and they've again made this pedestrian access, so it's very pleasant to walk around. On the south side of Tiananmen is the great railroad station, and this is where every day they say 1 million people come to Beijing. And many of them are coming to petition the government for redress of grievances out in the provinces, often complaining about their local corrupt officials. And so there's a lot of, you'll see a lot of country people coming to the capital. This was a tradition that goes back to imperial times. If any citizen could go and bow and offer a petition at the gates of the Forbidden City, and they're still doing it. There's other features all over town. Here's one of the Catholic churches. This is the permitted Catholic Church, which is independent of the Vatican. There's also numerous other religions that are allowed, Islam, and there are synagogues. There's all kinds of also Taoist and other temples in the city. But by and large, most Chinese are fairly secular. But you'll see a lot of life on the street. Now, this is these little neighborhoods with the wall compounds, walkways, alleyways. This is what they've been tearing down because the living conditions are not so good. Again, poor water, no sanitation, and also it gets very hot in the summer and gets very cold in the winter. But a lot of people prefer this to being up in big blocks. So I'll just show you some of the neighborhoods you can walk around. Often there's skyscrapers around, and these neighborhoods are often now, they'll come up and put a poster saying, due for demolition, we will compensate you. But there's a lot of, let's say, that kind of social network of living in a village in the big city. And some of them have been preserved so that you can go out on a hutong tour in a little pedicab and go visit. And someone was telling me there's even a restaurant where you can go and cook with a family and have a real home-style meal. And that's very much the flavor of Beijing. The Beijing old-time residents have their own language also, so that they are very much an ingrown group and often very much involved, maybe say, in the government industries. But a lot of them are just simple people having a job, fixing things, and providing services for the capital, particularly from the countryside, bringing in food. And this reminds me of a story of outside in the village, they realized there are all these restaurants opening up, and they're all serving Peking duck, and this is a good business to go into. So one village decided, well, we're going to set up the operation also. And so they went to a neighboring village and they got the local expert and they said, well, this is what you do, and get the coop, get the pond, get the ducks, and we'll come back and see how you did it. And so they set that up, and they then called the other villager to come by and see, and they said, well, everything's fine, but you went to the market and you bought 50 hens and 50 drakes. You should know that ducks are like chickens. You only need one rooster for all the hens. And so then the committee at the village said, well, in modern China, males and females are equal, and therefore we're going to leave that decision to the hens. Well, anyway, life goes on in spite of even equalization. But here's a guy setting up fixing tires on the street or bringing in vegetables. And you know, sometimes you get a little dizzy in China because there's this great self-consumptive elite that's driving around showing off their wealth, and then there's still hard-working people that are kind of scratching a living. And then often in the old neighborhoods in Beijing, because they're slated for demolition, there have been protests. Now there's a legal redress and advocates to try to help people that are being evicted from their home, usually for big real estate development, of course. And I tried to go into one of the markets in one of the little hutong neighborhoods, and I was stopped by a policeman. They had guarded off the whole neighborhood, and while I was arguing with this guy, I took a picture of his patch there. But as a foreigner, you're always being carefully monitored, even though you're not restricted in most places you can go. But there is a sort of a turmoil in China between the poor and the government and now the new commercial classes, and also the youth who will be putting up graffiti like this on some places. But most of Beijing has become a big glass box megacity, and this is somewhat the pride of the nation, sort of like Shanghai. They really wanted to show you the new things. They don't really think that the old things are so interesting. But this is Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace, which is the main east-west road. And like Shanghai, there's all kinds of new developments and big buildings being built, turning it into a city that doesn't really have much flavor, different from Tokyo or Seoul or anywhere else in the world of a new city. But some of it is quite striking and, of course, tremendous. And this is an area near Chaoyang district on the east side of the old city, where there's a lot of nightlife. And one thing you can say about the political control of China, they don't control fashion or music or fun anymore. So Beijing, like the rest of Chinese cities, is having a very good time, and often people can afford it as long as you don't organize and protest about politics. You don't challenge the rule of the emperor and render unto Caesar as Caesar demands. But there's a lot of nightlife going on. But this is one of the great new buildings. This is the Central Television headquarters. And there's only one channel, or rather one producer of media in China in television. But this building is quite a remarkable standing structure. And then it had another part of it being built behind. And then 3 years ago, they were having an opening celebration for their new headquarters. And they had a fireworks display, and it caught that building on fire, and it went up in a big inferno. Meanwhile, at the next door, they were broadcasting the celebration for their building, and for weeks they never mentioned on TV that half of their unit burnt down. Now, some other media in some other countries ignore their own plight to their own demise, but in China, now they fix this building up, but this is the sort of thing that happens here. Beijing is a political communication center for China, but some things happen and nobody knows about it. Most recently, the Nobel Prize being given to Liu Zhibo, who's in jail, and one of the drafters of the Charter for Democracy that was published almost 3 years ago, but many of them have now been put under either house arrest or to actual imprisonment, or what they call laogai, which is re-education through labor, as sort of the gulag. But when his wife went to tell him, Liu Zhibao, that he won the Nobel Prize, she was taken back by the police and put under house arrest. And so she's not allowed out of her house, just like my other friend, who's been that way for 21 years. Now, the question is, will this change and get better? But we don't know. Meanwhile, they're still building and fixing things, and as I say, kind of in a mad rush. And China has a sort of a sense of urgency, but also a sense of great national pride in what they can do when they decide to do things. Here's one of the great new buildings called the Egg, which is the Performing Arts Center. It's built as part of the building for the 2008 Olympics, along with all those stadiums and tremendous things. But what has also turned Beijing into is a great traffic jam. So they've been building the roads around, but they're producing so many vehicles that often the days look like this. So I just, this is something you may be familiar with where you're from, but it's the bane of modern society is this sort of congestion, which famously caused a traffic jam for 5 days, 100 kilometers up north of the Great Wall earlier this year. So this is one of the problems of China. Actually, one place in China, they're developing a bus that is up on struts so it can drive over the traffic jam, which may help somewhat. But the other big problem in Beijing, like many other Chinese cities, is the air pollution. So here's an example of how bad it gets, and maybe you felt it somewhat in Shanghai. But I think the air will be quite clear in Beijing because we have the big Siberian ventilation going on. So you have to get out your sweaters, but the air quality will not be as bad as it typically is, especially in the summer. Then as we leave, we'll go to the world's greatest airport, the biggest new Terminal 3 at the Beijing Airport. Now, unlike Heathrow, they just decide to build it and suddenly it's there. And like the Hong Kong airport, Shanghai airports, these have become such vast buildings that they're sometimes hard to get around as a mere human. But anyway, it's very efficient and very state-of-the-art, and then the transportation all in and out of China and around China has actually improved tremendously in the last few years. So I'm just going to finish up here by talking about a little about what is going to happen here. So there's an old story again in history in China that a court official was appointed to be the official historian of the imperial palace in the country, and he was congratulated and saying, well, this is great responsibility because you have to keep track of all the wars and uprisings and intrigues. And he said, oh no, that's the easy part. It's rewriting all the past history that takes up all my time. And so in China, for instance, in the school systems, all the history of China comes up to 1949, and anything after that is not discussed in the public education. A lot of people talk about it or know about it, but this means is that the control of information is essential to first of all, the rule of the country and also the direction of it. So if you get people upset by either past grievances or contemporary disputes, they may not cooperate as much as they would like to. But anyway, the central policies are the opening and reform, meaning that the country is no longer to be isolated and they will work to change their institutions for the betterment of the people. But as Deng Xiaoping described it, when you open up the windows, you get fresh air, but you also get flies and trouble, which is true in China, but it's better than being cooped up like the country was. The key principles for the government are also to keep stability of the economy and the territorial integrity of the nation and unify with Hong Kong and Taiwan. But of course they have problems in the borders because in Tibet and Inner Mongolia and out in Xinjiang in the Muslim areas, those are essentially still part of the old empire of the Qing dynasty. And for all of the rant of the Communist Party about being against imperialism, they insist upon the borders of the last imperial dynasty as that's naturally how China should be. But I describe this again, long-term planning, which is a key element in the economic planning especially, getting along with the rest of the world and having what they would call the peaceful evolution. So they are not looking for any particularly military conflict, and they do not have any alliances or any involvements internationally, but they are, of course, doing business everywhere. I list here the social tensions between the regions because there's so many areas and so many different languages in China. A lot of people don't get along, and it's only the national government that keeps it in order. It could easily break up into 4 or 5 countries if the center gave way, let's say in Beijing. But the biggest problem is the environmental deterioration, the water supplies especially. Now, the air may get cleaner if they clean up industrial processes and automobiles, but the water is a key lacking element, especially in the North China Plain. So they built the world's largest aqueduct from the world's largest dam on the Yangtze at the Three Gorges to provide water for the 500 million people who live up in the North China Plain and keep Beijing alive as a city. This may eventually lead to some political evolution, but that's the real challenge. You can read about it in the paper when Google gets banned or newspapers are seen or books are banned. That is the arm of the state, and there's a lot of people employed in China to watch other people and keep track of things. But when they have, for instance, an opening of daily access to Hong Kong and all of the Chinese publications that are critical of especially Beijing there, that means that there's a breach in the dam of control of information. And so China may very well change, especially as it becomes, let's say, the global partner of the rest of the world, and it cannot either disabuse its own people, and it also must cooperate in helping to solve the larger problems of the world as one of the major nations. Now, that poster that was on the little bit, this is a curious thing I found, which says, oppose economism, it's called in Chinese, but this is an old Red Guard poster saying we should, essentially, you do not develop an economy for the benefit of just the numbers of it. An economy must have a social purpose, and in this case, maintaining the revolutionary fervor, or however this poster implies it, but they did not want, this is completely what they have done. They have developed the economy for the benefit of the people, just for the sheer sake of getting China out of poverty and then becoming part of the larger world. So that kind of fervent propaganda and, let's say, the most strident communist period has turned into advertising, and here's kind of a spoof on it by the one of the artists in Beijing. And so some people said, well, the Communist Party is not really communist. It's made a deal with the devil, being private business and capitalism and financial institutions. But others would say that no, it's actually made a hybrid model, which is perhaps the best functional model for this century, where you have one-party control backed by military and police power, a restriction of information, and then great amounts of capital concentration in state corporations so that they can invest and build things and get things done, and then a population that is very, let's say, Confucian in that they follow the authorities to do what is told of them without too much protest. There's grumbling and occasional demonstrations, but not much complaint. And is this the question? Is this the form of evolution in human society that will actually be the most successful versus what we are used to? Our contentious governments and scrappy democracies and conflict, which means in many places, including my little town in New York, nothing seems to ever get done because everybody has an objection. But this model of this national socialism was tried in Italy and Germany in the last century, and it didn't work very well, but especially because the leadership was not as, let's say, sober and almost humble as the Chinese leadership. But if China ever had a mad leader like Mao again, this whole thing could get, the great locomotive could jump the tracks again. So therefore the political leadership is most modest. In fact, nobody really knows who's calling the shots or who's even in charge, and it's done by sort of like a giant village committee of consensus, but then everybody must follow it, and thereby there's a lot of action that happens in China just because of that central authority and ability to command the economy. But the next generation is really the question. Here's a poster again in Beijing for mobile communication services, and again in the same way of those Red Guard and other politicized era. Now there's a kind of an individualized quality. If you can get communications so easily and also end up traveling around the world and communicating with the larger human community, then China will not be isolated and will not go back to the trouble that it had before, we hope. And so here's another post that just says we are going to make a green environment that'll be healthy, and we will promote a spiritual civilization, which is what they call, let's say, a mature nation with manners and capabilities and also respect for each other, and including human rights. They will say that the government in China will say they've provided more human rights to their people in the last 20 years than anybody really realizes, even if they have a few dissidents. But the future is going to be like this. This is a new city that they're planning outside of Beijing. They believe that they're going to keep having 100, 200, 300 million more people move to the cities of China in the next couple of generations, and they can't all be downtown, no matter how big they build it. So they're beginning to build satellite cities. This is on the south side of Beijing, where there is a canal that connects on the Grand Canal, but they're going to widen it and make it a water city with this kind of development that then will be the place where China can grow. And we hope that it will be successful just for the sake of not just the Chinese nation, but also our economies and the world are very much invested and connected to the success of China. So we hope that, wish the plans well. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for the time to be with you on this trip, however it's been, and wish you a good trip home, and I hope you have a good time in Beijing. Thank you very much, and bon voyage. Thank you.